Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today we're talking about this. This is the Minisforum MS-01, and if you've been following the world of little microservers and micro power PCs for a while, there's every possibility you've heard of this. Hong Kong based company Minisforum released this device, I would say, about 3 or 4 months ago, and frankly, as far as mini workstations go, this is almost as good as it gets. Absolutely tiny, fitting pretty much in your hand nice and easily. This system, and this has been reviewed in a bunch of places online. I recommend you check them out. I'll link to probably my favourite review down there, Laurie over at Take Notice. He helped me out with a little bit for the review on this. This device here, as far as workstations go, is the tippity-toppity. But you didn't come here for that, did you? This isn't a review of this device per se. I want to talk about this device as a NAS, because you may be aware that not just a mini workstation PC, this device, 1, being incredibly compact, 2, absolutely riddled in ventilation, 3, is very low noise when in use, arrives with 2 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. It also arrives with 2 10 GB ports there on the rear. It's even got USB 4 connectivity and 10 gig USB connectivity. And hell, on top of that, when you open the device up, you find out that alongside this mind-numbingly powerful SoC 13th generation i9 processor inside there, lots of other configs available, a PCIe Gen 4x16 slot, although half height, half width, and definitely 1U there all the way along. On top of that, on the base, you find out inside that you've got 3 more M.2 slots inside, and even the potential to convert one of them into U.2 inside there. All of that adds up to a whole amount of storage potential, a whole amount of network potential, a whole amount of power and capability and scalability there. So the big question is, the Minisforum MS-01, as great as it is as a workstation, what about its use as a NAS? Well, I'll say right now, it's pretty hard to beat. Inside, those 3 M.2 NVMe slots inside, on the face of it, seem absolutely fantastic. But you've got to add the caveat, they are not all the same speed. When we went in via UnRAID there, went in also, by the way, with the Windows software included with, more on that later on, we found out that those 3 slots aren't all PCIe Gen 3x4. And Minisforum doesn't keep a secret of this, by the way. It's all on their own specifications pages. The first slot is Gen 4x4, the second slot is Gen 3x4, and the third slot is Gen 3x2. That means between them, the bandwidth diminishes. They've still done a great deal of work, and I would argue positively, across the whole system, spreading out the available lanes, but that does mean that the performance of each of those M.2s, you can't really RAID storage across them. The performance is just too fluctuating, and you'll end up bottlenecking yourself. So this is really going to be a system where you're going to have independent storage containers. When we did our performance in UnRAID there, we saw consistent numbers on the 4x4 slot of 6.2 gigabytes per second on a 10 gig repeating test in read, and 4.5 gigabytes per second persistent performance, 1 gig file on write. Scaling to slot 2, we saw that the Gen 3x4 slot was giving us 3.1 gigabytes per second over 2.5 gigabytes per second, and finally the Gen 3x2 slot gave us 1.6 read over 1.5 write. All of those numbers are perfectly fine for their respective gens and speed across each of those lanes, but had we rated them together, it would have been a very different story. So do keep that in mind with this device being used as a NAS, that all 3 of those storage slots deviate quite wildly in terms of their overall bandwidth. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, it just means you're not going to get peak Gen 4. Now, when it came to the PCIe upgrade slot there, we stuck in a few different micro cards that we could find, and weirdly, one of the best that we found that worked really, really well is when we installed this. This is an Acer Store upgrade card, and this is a Gen 3 card that has got a 10 gig network port there on the rear, and it also arrives with 2 M.2 slots inside. It's nicely officially for use inside this system. That's an Acer Store card for Acer Store NAS devices, but we were able to install this inside and add ourselves a couple more M.2 slots inside and a 10 GBE slot there. The BIOS was something to play with, more on that later on. Now, because of that CPU power use on this device was expectedly higher than the average Celeron or low-end SoC that we've seen, being an i9 13th generation, but still nonetheless, when we were accessing all three drives simultaneously, power consumption went from around 38 watts to around about 45 watts at peak, and that was the CPU at about 40 to 45% utilization. Now, during idle, we saw it come down quite significantly. It went down to 17 to 19 watts, which I know a number of you, turnkey NAS users are going to say that's quite a lot, but I would argue for the kind of storage potential, for a mini PC, particularly one with a chunky external PSU, I was still quite pleased with that. At peak, whenever we pinged the device over the network, we saw it creep up to about 21, close to 21.5 watts there. Now, when I said about pinging the device, it's also worth highlighting that the BIOS on this was very, very modifiable. When we went into it there, not only was it a great deal more glossier than what we're used to, thank you very much, Minisforum, but on top of that, it gave us a great deal of scalability for the PCIe slots, and not too much in where we could, bifurcate or move it around between each of them, but you could scale them quite up and down quite well. So there's a chance that you could play with that a great deal more in your own bespoke network setup there within that BIOS. I would also add that when you get this device for the first time, if you are going to go down the road of using it as a NAS, I do recommend that you go into the BIOS settings there and play with the secure boot, because by default it will boot if you get this device with the 1TB and 32 gig SSD options. We'll talk about price in a moment. 32 gig DDR5 memory options inside there. It will have secure boot fixed to that initial drive. Thanks to Brandon Lee over at Virtualization How To. I've linked to his video in the description there, where you went through a guide down just exactly how to override that secure boot there, because you need to go in with an admin password that's not actually there by default. But nonetheless, it did mean that we could run UnRAID on this really, really easily, and you could definitely see the pathway to install something like TrueNAS very, very straightforwardly on this. Again, there is only 3 drives by default inside, so the utilization of that PCIe slot with a storage upgrade card is definitely the way to go. But just keep in mind, because of the half depth of the device, you're not really going to get cards that give you more than 2 extra M2 slots. On the plus side though, because of the NICs on the back there, you do not need to worry about utilizing that PCIe slot for a network upgrade. 2 times 10 GBE SFP is going to be hugely beneficial, and you've still got the 2.5 gigs for your bog standard network management on this device and low priority connections. Add to that the fact that even if you're not running a fiber network for those SFP network connections, you can go ahead and get SFP to copper converters like the ones we've talked about here on the channel before, which by the way are becoming increasingly affordable, which allow you to add copper 10Gs on this. Just keep in mind that when we had 2 copper 10Gs here and connecting this device, so our Sodolo 5 times 2.5 G, 4 times 2.5 GBE to 10 gig network switch, having turned them together simply got too hot. So keep in mind, if you are going to be using converters to utilize something like this as a NAS, those adapters get real hot. Then it comes down to the CPU choice and the different architecture choices for this device you can find in the market. Right now, you can get this for as low as $429, and that $429 gives you the device with the i5 12th generation CPU inside with 20 lanes to play with there, and that are again for $429 nickel for a pre-built device with 2 10G ports and 3 M.2 NVMe slots inside that you can add a couple more M2s inside for, is pretty darn brilliant. When you scale things up, it goes up to a maximum 819 nickel, and for 819 you get not only the i9 13th generation that we've got here on the table, and by the way, it comes in a much prettier box than that one. On top of that, it also arrives with a 1TB Kingston Gen 4 SSD inside and 32 gig of DDR5 memory there. CPU choices like that, scaling up to a 14-core CPU with 6 power 8 efficiency cores, is impressive. But we also have to address the big error-correcting code elephant in the room. This device does not have ECC memory on board, and that is one of the painful elements of utilizing this in a NAS capacity that is going to be off-putting for a lot of users. The lack of ECC support on this means that when you're sending data from that CPU onto the RAM memory, or through the memory I should say, incredibly fast, inconsistencies may not be checked as thoroughly as you like. There's going to be users out there highlighting that it's got on die, it's DDR5, it's built in, it's got ECC. It doesn't. On die only affects memory inconsistencies within the cells of the memory, not inconsistencies via the CPU into the memory handling there. So keep that in mind. Ultimately, as a NAS server, I can't say the Minisforum MS-01 is an enterprise grade solution. I just can't say that. But I will say for those of you that have been looking at pre-built NAS solutions in Flash and you're looking at 3 to 4 drives and you're not too worried about RAID functionality there, spreading it across the drives, instead enjoying the individual performance of different drives, this is a great solution. And don't overlook that the 10 gig NICs on this make up, I would argue, a significant portion of the entry price even into that i5 model. It is not an enterprise grade NAS solution, but I will say for the base level hardware you're getting inside, I would still nonetheless recommend this as a NAS solution with your TrueNAS or your UnRAID to everyone else under that, maybe even SMB, your medium-sized businesses there, because given its scale and its portability and its low impact in most office environments, it is a phenomenal solution for DIY compared to pretty much everything else in the market. If you don't want to build from scratch, you don't want to get a MOBO and an SoC on board, start knocking around with SATA fan-out cables, knocking around, getting the right PSU, and you want a pretty much retail box solution for the OS of your choice, it's a great option. Alongside those 10 gig network ports and the 2.5 gig network ports, there's also, of course, the USB 4 ports here for us to talk about that also support Thunderbolt to Ethernet connectivity up to 20 gig. Now, that's going to be massively, dependent in a NAS utilization on the OS of choice, because that Thunderbolt Ethernet connection there is predominantly designed to connect clients to clients and allow file transmission to be a great deal quicker. It is not really designed with NAS in mind, and we didn't get an opportunity to test Thunderbolt connectivity in this as a NAS, something we will be doing as soon as we get the card back in here. It's being used in another video. If I had to compare this to a turnkey NAS solution in the market, it would probably be the QNAP TBS H574TX. That's QNAP's Thunderbolt and 10GBE 13th generation Intel Core solution. Now, that knocks around for between $1,500 and $2,000, again, depending on your tax, location, and your shipping. This, on the other hand, if you go for the fully spec'd out model, you're looking at a little over maybe $850 there. Yes, you're missing out on Thunderbolt networking, probably, but in every other regard, this still does give you a tremendous amount of hardware. You're just going to have to do all of the legwork yourself in terms of the software. But for some users with the right skill set, this as a NAS is going to be worth the saving there. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. We've done a full breakdown below about this device, what we think of it and its suitability as a NAS solution over at NAScompares, along with links with where to get hold of this yourself. And if you're going to go to those shops anyway, why not use those links? It will really help us out, but only if you're going to go to those shops anyway. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourself a fantastic week, and I'll see you next time.